My mother-in-law went on a rant when she heard we were adopting. She said she couldn't bear the idea of Nancy's biological child being her first grandchild. She even suggested divorcing my husband and then adopting, or sending the child to foster care. But I'm Nancy, and I won't abandon my brother-in-law's child just to please her. So fine. I'll do what she wants. I'm 45 years old and recently moved to the countryside, where I used to live as a child. With remote work being so common now, I can live wherever I want. My allergies were awful in the city, but they've calmed down here with the cleaner air. Country life might not be for everyone, but it suits me just fine. Sure, the nearest supermarket is far and the houses are spread out, but I love the open space. I used to think city life was a pain when I was in my late 20s. Back then, I had just married Ken, and we were really close. But there was a big problem. Ken's mom was way too attached to him. It makes sense, since he's her only child. She'd call his work just to talk to him, and she'd hassle his girlfriends like crazy. She did a lot of weird stuff out of love for her son. Ken was really bothered by her when we were dating. He kept me a secret from her to protect me from what he called the evil queen. He was worried she'd treat me like she treated his exes. But once we got married, I couldn't stay hidden. Ken finally told her about me, and her reaction was intense. I heard her on the phone saying, "Let me meet her. If she's no good, I'll put her in her place." She must have felt shocked. She thought her son was all hers, and then suddenly there's a new woman he wants to marry. Why did I marry a man with such a mother? Simple. I loved him. That was the only reason. When I was sick, he'd take care of me, making me porridge and shedding tears at sappy movies. He even helped lost kids find their parents, even if it meant being late for our plans. He might not always seem competent, but deep down, he's really kind. That's what I adore about him, and why I wanted to be with him. So no matter how difficult his mother might be, I was ready to face her. Loving couples overcome obstacles, and in the end, they live happily ever after. That's the classic tale. But don't worry. When I met her for the wedding, she immediately threw a vase at me, shouting, "You thief cat." Can you believe people actually say thief cat? I was prepared, but her attack caught me off guard. A woman who never acknowledged me during our dating days didn't seem fit to judge. My son deserves someone better. I won't accept an orphan as my daughter-in-law, she went on. Yes, it's true. I don't have parents. My dad passed when I was in high school and my mom died when I was 20. I don't come from any special background, and by the time you hit your 40s or 50s, most people have lost their parents. Using that as a reason to disapprove of our marriage was just wrong. Luckily, my father-in-law stood up to her. You can't judge someone's character just based on their past. It's rude. Ken is old enough to make his own decisions. Just let him marry, he argued. But my mother-in-law isn't one to easily listen to her husband. In the end, she never officially accepted our marriage, so we secretly tied the knot on her father-in-law's advice. Even if we waited forever, she'd never give her blessing. I wanted to be with my husband in this life and the next. But that didn't mean I'd give up on our marriage in this life. I was ready to live as a married couple without ever telling my mother-in-law. A few months after we got married, we unexpectedly ran into her while shopping. Both of us proudly wore our engagement and wedding rings on our left hands. We were completely wrapped up in our newly bliss, happily strolling hand in hand while shopping, much to my mother-in-law's annoyance. She instantly caught sight of our rings and erupted into a tirade right there in the middle of the supermarket, oblivious to the curious glances from other shoppers. It turned out she'd been told by my father-in-law that we had called off our marriage and broken up. Neither my husband nor I knew about this story. Apparently, my father-in-law had shared it on his own. Feeling betrayed by both her husband and her son, my mother-in-law was livid. While I understood my father-in-law's intention to protect us, I couldn't help but regret not coordinating our story better to avoid such an easily uncovered lie. It must have hurt her deeply to be deceived in such a way. Her grip on my husband tightened, and despite his attempts to distance himself, she refused to let go. She began showing up at our doorstep daily, and eventually she moved in without so much as returning to her own home. Why did we allow her entry, you wonder? Well, each day she'd ring the doorbell, shouting through the thin walls, "Let me in. Are you planning to leave me out in the cold?" We had no choice but to let her in, at least temporarily. We attempted to remove her from our home several times, but she would always go to the police, claiming, "My son and his wife kicked me out." Feeling sympathetic toward the authorities, I decided to handle this family matter privately, although I had no clue how to deal with it. Despite numerous arguments and my husband's repeated demands for her to leave, she stubbornly refused. In fact, she seemed to relish the idea of being disliked. If she could wear us down and make us give up, it would be a victory for her, so she put all her energy into it. Her harassment toward me escalated. She would throw away my things without asking and ruin my cooking by pouring vinegar into it, making it inedible. These were just the beginning. What shocked me most was the garbage she left out. I discovered bags marked with "stupid" at the collection site. When I turned them around, I found "Nancy Thief Cat" written on the other side, forcing me to flip them again. At first, my father-in-law would visit daily, hoping to take her home, but eventually he stopped coming. My husband, too, became too busy and exhausted from arguing with his mother. Instead of insisting she leave, he started ignoring her. He even told me, "Don't bother cooking for my mom. Pretend she's not here." It was disheartening to see my kind husband pushed to this point, a testament to my mother-in-law's tenacity. Initially hurt by her son's neglect, she seemed determined to drive us apart. She shamelessly continued living in our home. Then one day we received devastating news. My brother and his wife had tragically died in a car accident while out with their family. Losing my supportive brother and kind sister-in-law was incredibly painful. But I couldn't afford to just wallow in grief. They left behind a 5-year-old son, Kyle. At the funeral and wake, relatives were passing around responsibility, asking, "Who will take care of him?" Nancy would be the best option. But what if Nancy refuses? Despite feeling somewhat distant from these relatives, their callousness was unsettling. I had always cherished Kyle as my first nephew and felt a strong bond with him, wanting to care for him if possible. But I worried about the impact on him of losing his parents and then being taken in by his aunt and uncle. Most importantly, I feared my husband's reaction. However, before I could even broach the subject, my husband said, "If Kyle doesn't mind, let's take him in ourselves." Kyle expressed his desire to live with us, so I decided to formally adopt him as my son. What about this child? On the day I brought Kyle home, my mother-in-law stared at him expressionlessly. My husband stayed silent, so I spoke up. "He's my nephew. We're going to raise him as our son." With the knowledge of my brother and his wife's passing, my mother-in-law seemed to grasp the situation from just that one sentence. "You're bringing in that child?" she questioned. "Yes, we're moving forward with the adoption process." Adoption, can you believe it? That child is Nancy's blood relative. I can't bear the thought of such a child becoming my first grandchild. Get a divorce and then adopt him, or better yet, send him to a foster home. Suddenly, my mother-in-law erupted in anger, leaving poor Kyle bewildered by her outburst. "Why do we need your approval to care for this child? Please don't meddle in our marriage." "Absolutely not. That child will become my first grandchild, right? A child who doesn't share a drop of Ken's blood. I will never accept that," she declared, hurling the remote control at us. In an instant, my husband rushed to shield Kyle from the impact. "Kyle will simply be our adopted son, and nothing changes between him and you," I reassured her, but it felt like speaking to someone who refused to listen. "She's not against Kyle being adopted. She just can't stand the fact that we're still married," my husband muttered, his tone filled with frustration. "Well, if that's what she wants," my husband and I nearly said simultaneously that day, understanding that staying in that house wouldn't be good for Kyle. We decided to leave and move to a hotel. It's frustrating to have to leave our own home, but it's for Kyle's well-being. We see it as a temporary inconvenience until we can finally find a way to remove my mother-in-law from our lives for good. A week later, my husband and I finally returned home. It seemed even my stubborn mother-in-law was concerned, as we hadn't been back for a while. There was a moment of relief on her face when she saw us, followed by a smile. It seemed she was pleased that Kyle wasn't with us. "You've given up on the adoption," she said cheerfully. Neither my husband nor I replied as we quietly made our way to the living room. "You two went ahead with a marriage against my wishes, and now an adoption. That's just absurd. But at least you've come to your senses," she muttered to herself. My husband sat silently, taking several pamphlets out of his bag and laying them out in front of her. Choose any place you like, he said. She was taken aback by the pamphlets and my husband's words. What's this? What do you mean? You told us to choose between divorce or a facility, correct? Well, we've chosen a facility for you, my husband and I said with sly smiles, causing her expression to stiffen. She looked at my husband in panic, but he responded coldly. Do you think we're joking? I'm dead serious. I'm only in my 60s. I can't go to a facility. And remember how you hid my belongings, despite me telling you not to. I added. She didn't know how to respond to my accusation. That was just a mistake. It's a sign of dementia, she stuttered. Also, you always make a mess of the room after I've tidied it up, my husband chimed in. Her expression tightened. I'm getting older, so that's not acceptable. It could be an early sign of dementia, losing the ability to tidy up or starting to collect junk. And Mom, you've been hoarding items from that pop star. Those are just useless junk, right? I remarked. Well, that's another sign of progressing dementia, my husband chimed in. As we confronted her, she burst out, What's gotten into you two? You gave us the choice between divorce or a facility, so we chose the facility. Right on cue, the doorbell rang. Looks like they're here, my husband said casually. I nodded and hurried to the door, where my father-in-law stood waiting. Sorry for the delay, he apologized. Observing the scene, my mother-in-law looked bewildered and asked, Why is he here? With a mischievous grin, my husband quipped, Since it was either divorce or a facility, let's go with divorce. Caught off guard by my father-in-law's sudden mention of divorce, she was left speechless. Nobody specified whose divorce or whose stay in the facility. We decided it's your divorce and your move to the facility. Why do I always end up being the scapegoat? She muttered as my father-in-law began to argue, insisting that she wasn't at fault. My dear, it seems you've abandoned everything, including our home, and caused nothing but trouble for our son, my father-in-law scolded. I've repeatedly told you to come back home, stop bothering our son, and take care of the house. What are you saying, acting like some old-fashioned dictator? Take care of the house yourself, she snapped. Of course I am, but you've taken on too much, like all that community work, right? Your absence has left the house empty, and now I'm left handling everything. Naturally, I have complaints, my father-in-law fired back. Yes, my mother-in-law, who once relished being a stay-at-home mom, seemed to have overloaded herself with community responsibilities, like paperwork and event planning. Since she started neglecting her duties at home, I chimed in. Not wanting to burden the community association, my father-in-law has been struggling to juggle both his job and the tasks she left unfinished. He stopped fetching her because he got too wrapped up in community affairs, my husband explained. I'm exhausted by all this. It's becoming overwhelming. You need to choose between divorce or going to a facility, I asserted. This can't be right. I'm not the one at fault here. I won't go to a facility, and I don't want a divorce. It feels like everything might fall apart just by being around you, she protested. Seeing my father-in-law's exhaustion, my mother-in-law seemed to realize that it was all coming to an end and simply hung her head. You've been plotting to divorce us, but you should cherish your husband. He's a human being too, and he might just divorce you. Oh wait, he is divorcing you. I chuckled. This must have irritated her, but she remained silent. Perhaps she no longer had the energy to argue. And so my in-laws divorced, and Kyle officially became our son. As we proceeded with the divorce process, my mother-in-law returned to her marital home. Meanwhile, my husband and I moved secretly with the assistance of my father-in-law. As of now, she hasn't been able to locate us. With limited finances and little knowledge of the internet, it's doubtful that my mother-in-law could track us down out of state. However, since the property originally belonged to my father-in-law's family, she was swiftly evicted and divorced. Apparently, during the chaos of the divorce, she had pleaded with my father-in-law not to divorce her, even begging on her knees, claiming she didn't want to divorce at her age. As a homemaker, she had no savings. She attempted to claim a portion of the assets, but since there wasn't much to begin with, she has been struggling to make ends meet on her own. Despite needing assistance, both my father-in-law and husband have distanced themselves from her. She attempted to rely on a distant cousin she hadn't been in touch with for years, only to be turned down with the explanation, "We can't afford to support another adult. You need to fend for yourself. She should seek employment instead of relying on others." But she has yet to do so. However, I'll keep that observation to myself. In the meantime, my husband and I have welcomed a daughter, Camila, into our family, and Kyle is thriving in his new home with us. Camila grew up believing Kyle was her biological brother until she reached junior high school. Although we've since revealed the truth to her, their bond remains unshaken. Kyle plays various roles in Camila's life. Sometimes a brother, sometimes a parental figure, always watching out for her. When a neighborhood boy bullied Camila in elementary school, it was Kyle who rushed to her aid first, not us. If Camila ever decides to marry, I'm sure Kyle will be even more discerning of her potential suitors than my husband. Kyle, who initially struggled to express affection, now affectionately calls me Mom and has grown particularly close to my husband, spending weekends fishing together. Honestly, I can't help but feel a twinge of envy at their bond. Kyle is the cherished child left behind by my dear brother and his wife, and I'm committed to nurturing him as my own for the rest of my days. Now, let's take a look at what the boys have caught and whip up a delicious dinner with my daughter. I'll put my homemaking skills to the test and impress everyone. Just kidding.